So hello, everybody. Welcome and thanks so much for joining us for today's Space for Dialogue Roundtable. My name is Amelia Kale, and I'm the Harvey P. and Barbara C. Hood 1918 Curator of Academic Programming. I was going to say here, at least virtually here, at the Hood Museum of Art. So today's program is titled Creative Curating in a Digital Time. And it is a roundtable with several of our interns this year talking about their virtual Space for Dialogue projects. So Space for Dialogue is a series of student curated exhibitions that started in 2001. Since then, we've had over 100 different exhibitions where students take objects from the museum's collection and create their own exhibition, coming up with the concept, with the text, with the research, and with the exhibition design. So last year, with the onset of the pandemic, as you might imagine, that created a real challenge for us. We knew we had a great slate of interns. We have over a dozen interns at the museum this year, and we have 8 who are doing Space for Dialogue projects. But we were confronted with this issue. The museum was closed to the public last spring, and it looked pretty clear that it was not going to be open throughout the school year. I guess that was a moving target, right? First we were closed for a few weeks, then a few months. And as that became clear, we needed to come up with another way to support these students and to allow them to do these exhibition projects. So we turned to a strategy that we had used before in 2016 and 2017 when the Hood was closed for expansion and renovation. And that is creating virtual Space for Dialogue. So creating websites, which did the same kind of curatorial work, but in a different curatorial form. So curatorial work always has constraints. There's always constraints on how big the wall is, how big the pieces are, what condition looks like. Here we didn't have some of those constraints, but there were certainly other ones. So we were really interested in what kind of creative projects the students could come up with within the possibilities and constraints of website design. And I really want to thank the support of Dartmouth College and particularly Bill Malachak, who helped with the WordPress design side, the technical side of the students putting together their websites. That is certainly far outside my purview, and we really couldn't have done it without his support. So I just want to draw your attention to the range of virtual Space for Dialogue projects that the students explored today. Everything from ancient art to photography, to poetry and literary sources. And so that range is really what makes this program so exciting and so dynamic and really showcasing the scholarship and creativity of our interns. And I want to draw attention to 3 of our interns who did virtual Space for Dialogue projects, but were not able to join us today for today's roundtable because of their class schedule. So Aiden Chisholm's project, which is titled Out of Body, and Alicia Gonzalez's project titled Contemporary Indigenous Photography and Self-Determination, and Sophie Kamhai's project, The Rise of Icarus, The Resurgence of the Fall of Icarus as a Modern Myth. So to highlight their work as well. And also just to let you know that because it's May and we're still in the middle of the Dartmouth term, kind of heading toward the end, that not everyone's Space for Dialogues are finished quite yet, so we can't showcase everyone's, but we're going to talk about the process here today. And there will be some that will be done, and the other ones will be done in the next few weeks. So I'd like to introduce our 5 students. Actually, I'd like to have our 5 panelists today introduce themselves. And I'd love to start with Claudia.
Hi, my name is Claudia Bernstein. I'm a 21, and I worked as the class of 1954 intern at the Hood Museum this year with Amelia. I'm double majoring in art history and psychology, and through my art history studies have developed a particular interest in contemporary photography. My virtual Space for Dialogue, which is titled Overexposure, Photography in the Nude, explores how the medium of photography has radically altered and complicated our conception of the art historical nude, and focusing specifically on images made from the 1960s onward.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm also 21, and I'm one of the programming interns at the Hood Museum this year. I'm an English major and I'm minoring in art history and religion. And so I'm really interested in sort of the way that we tell stories specifically, and the way that we describe ourselves and think about ourselves. And that's sort of been a through line of all of my studies. And so the exhibit that I worked on here at the Hood is titled In a Gallery Out of Context, Ancient Art and Academia. And I was really interested in sort of the the frame that being in a museum places on an object, and the way that knowing the story behind the object might change our view of it, or even maybe let us relate to it more. So that's one thing that I'm sort of exploring in this very non-traditional, more experiential exhibit that I curated.
Hi everyone, my name's Hallie and I'm excuse me, I'm a 21 majoring in art history and minoring in public policy. I'm currently the Levinson intern for campus engagement, and I work closely with Isadora Italia on a variety of student engagement initiatives, such as helping run the museum club. For my virtual space for dialogue, which is titled No Place Like Home, I've chosen to explore how artists have rendered the idea of home and belonging through abstract architecture.
Hi everyone, my name is Hadley. I'm a 22. I am the Airby family curatorial intern, and I work alongside Amelia drafting curatorial acquisition reports for a number of artworks that the Hood has acquired. In addition to that, I've been curating my space for dialogue, which explores rites of passage. So looking at sort of watershed moments in the life of people, and looking at this transition from one state of being to another, for instance, marriage, education, childbirth, and the like.
Hi everyone, I'm Courtney Mckee. I'm a 21. I'm the Conroy programming intern this year, so I work with Caroline and Nelia McNulty. My exhibition is called The Craft of Activism, Materialism, Collective Action, and the Subversive Power of Creation. Sort of a mouthful, but I'm basically exploring the questions: how has craft making been politicized in response to social, environmental, and economic injustices? And how and to what extent can craft making generate change and empower its practitioners?
Thank you, Claudia, Caroline, Hadley, and Courtney. I really appreciate you joining us today. So I'm going to start off with a pretty general question, which is, how did you determine the theme for your space for dialogue? Did you start with an idea? Did you start with an object? A little bit of combination of both? And Hallie, do you want to start us off?
Yes. So I sort of like to describe how I landed on a theme of home through a combination of the discovery of one object and sort of this underlying fascination with architecture and the idea of home. So my website describes this more in depth in a section I've titled Notes from Home, but just to sum up, having grown up in multiple countries, I've always been fascinated by the idea of home and belonging. And in art, the way I've always explored this is through both physical architecture and artistic drawings and paintings of architecture. And the desire to explore home was definitely impacted by the fact that the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic last March sent many people around the world back home, whatever space that meant for them. So while looking through the Hood's collection, these ideas subconsciously occupied my brain, and I was definitely drawn to many prints and paintings of abstract architecture, as you can see here. And in exploring these works more, I quickly realized that they could be characterized by how artists use their own medium to render and explore their own conceptions of home and identity.
Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, so I kind of started with an object, actually. I knew that I really wanted to talk about the Assyrian reliefs, specifically because I'd studied them in a lot of different classes. They're something that the Hood Museum is very proud of and comes up a lot, at least in the different courses that I took at Dartmouth. But I had been exposed to them a few times before I actually heard the story of how they arrived, and that totally changed the way that I viewed this object and the relationship that I had to it, because I think it brings up a lot of really interesting questions about, how art arrives at museums, what the museum space means, what our responsibility is for objects, and whether or not, we should be telling these stories was something that I was really kind of concerned with. And so that was the main start, I guess, for me thinking about, a virtual gallery setting, putting objects back into context or maybe taking them out of the context that we put them in. And then from there, I knew that I wanted to do something sort of capitalizing on the fact that we're in a virtual setting, as opposed to taking something that would have been traditional and like shoehorning it into a website. And so I thought about ways that I could do something that could only be done virtually. And that was really taking these ancient objects and putting them into sort of a vacuum almost, and considering what they're like when they're not all in dialogue with each other, when they're not, in a gallery that we expect them to be in.
Thanks, Caroline. And Claudia, can you tell us a little bit about your theme, how you figured out your theme?
Yeah, so from the start of brainstorming on the theme of my show, I always knew I wanted to deal specifically with photography. The Hood has a rich collection of photographs of all different kinds, and I found myself searching the collection for a long time, trying to formulate my idea. I kept returning to two photographs in particular, which are on the slide. On the left, Carrie Mae Weems's Not Monet's Type, which I'd interacted with when doing research for a course I took called The Photographic Medium with a visiting professor named Alan Doyle. I also knew I wanted to include on the right Francesca Woodman's Untitled from the Eel series Rome, which I became aware of during a visit to the museum through my intro to photography class with Professor Virginia Behan. I knew I was drawn to photographs that depicted human subjects and explored the implications of rendering the body on film. I debated focusing on different themes related to these images, such as self-portraiture and the gaze, but ultimately ended up broadening my space for dialogue to include other images that dealt more broadly with photographing nudity and the gaze.
Thank you. So once you decided on a theme, what kind of research did you undertake? Hallie, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So for me, research was definitely one of the more difficult parts of the process, but also one of the ways in which I feel like I grew the most during this internship, which was great. In the fall, I was actually lucky enough to be able to go into the Bernstein Center for Object Study to research some of my objects, and Amelia kindly pulled all of the, I think, 24 object files that I requested to look at, which was super helpful. So I spent the afternoon sifting through all the files and taking pictures on my phone to reference later on. And just the ability to be able to go into the museum was a huge help for my own research and process, and helped me narrow my focus to the 12 works that I ultimately ended up settling on. So just want to thank Amelia and the rest of the Hood staff for making that happen. Some of the files had a ton of information in them, in which case I almost exclusively used these and my own interpretations from close looking exercises to draft object labels. But others only had a catalog sheet, which sort of felt more ominous to me. Because the nature of my internship is focused on campus engagement and not curatorial, I was challenged by some of those objects that had less research and the scholarly material on them and their artists. But Isadora and Amelia were very helpful in reminding me that the job of a curator is not only to explain what the object is, but to subtly imbue their own conceptions of the work in the object label, sort of to help guide viewers and help them think more deeply about a work. Which is why no two object labels are ever the same, even if they accompany the same object.
Great, thanks, Hallie.
Yeah, so I sort of created a close looking exercise, basically. That's what my exhibit really functions as. And so when I was doing my research, I just sort of started with the things that I would have wanted to know when I was looking at these objects, remembering what it was like to encounter them for the first time. And some of the objects that I included in the exhibit, I was encountering for the first time. And so I let my research sort of be guided by my own curiosity, which is probably not the most academic thing to say, but I didn't start with what are the materials or what was the date or those things that usually start on the object label, but instead I just thought, what am I looking at here? Like who made this? Where did it come from? What does it mean? And the kinds of questions that I think we would ask about objects in our own life, as opposed to something that we see in the museum. And I was really trying to get back to treating these ancient objects as just things that people made, and things that were important to somebody and that somebody paid for, and those kinds of things. And that led me to, I think, while I include all of the things that are normally on an object label in a regular gallery context, I think I wound up including some other aspects of these pieces that I probably wouldn't have encountered if I had just started with the facts that I think I was supposed to have been looking for. And I think that it taught me a lot about the different paths that one takes in research really could bring you to very different places, and letting yourself just explore a little bit brought me to some really, really fascinating places.
Thanks, Caroline. Hadley?
So despite being unable to access some of the in-person resources that Dartmouth offers, I, like my fellow interns, are very lucky in the sense that we get access to the sort of Dartmouth brain tank. And so a big part of my research was actually guided by a discussion that I had with an anthropology professor, Sienna Craig, who actually teaches a class called Cultural and Biological Rites of Passage, I believe. So great starting point, great point of departure. And she sort of turned me on to a lot of great literary resources and scholarly writing on rites of passage that I could then use to sort of frame the artworks that I selected in. From there, I also relied heavily on JSTOR and some other academic repositories for scholarly writing, often on the sort of the subject matter that I was working with. So, for instance, there is a sculpture that I include that depicts a midwife. I know very little about midwifery, and there's very little literature on artistic representations of midwifery, but there's a wealth of information on midwifery as a whole. So sort of taking all of these sort of disparate sources, pulling them together, and then creating a narrative from that. That was sort of the trickiest but most interesting part of the whole research process for me.
So I know you all decided on a theme, you did some research, and many of you had a pretty big selection of objects, more objects than it would really be feasible or even be kind of smart to put into an exhibition. So how did you narrow down your object choices? And we'll start with Claudia.
I definitely struggled initially to narrow my object choices. The category of nude photographic portraits is very broad, and I knew I could take the show in a million different directions in terms of subject matter, and the implications of different aspects of the gaze in portraits. I initially wanted to include a lot more images than would be digestible or cohesive for the sake of a show, and spanning all different time periods. For example, I was originally intent on including Gorilla Girls, Do Women Have to Be Naked to Get into the Met Museum, which is being shown on the slide right now. I thought that this might be a great example of the problem of hypersexualization of female bodies in the art historical canon, but ultimately decided that it was too much of an outlier. It didn't deal specifically with photography, is itself an entirely different medium. It's more of a poster, and didn't fit well aesthetically with my other works, which were all black and white photographs, which would contrast poorly with the pop art appearance of this, which should be obvious, but wasn't immediately apparent to me because I was sort of in the throes of it all. I ultimately narrowed all my works to include just photographs made roughly from the 1960s through the 1980s, where I identified important transitions in nude photography occurring from passive voyeurism to works that deal more explicitly and head on with issues of race, gender, and sexuality.
Thanks, Claudia. Courtney, could you tell us a little bit about your narrowing down process?
Yeah, sure. So I knew I wanted to cover a lot of different mediums or media, excuse me, because I was talking about crafts and craft making. So originally I thought I was going to compare quilt to a quilt, compare marquetry to marquetry, but I found that when looking through the collection, objects in different media kind of told similar stories. So then I wanted to sort of explore different stories I could tell through contrast specifically. And once I decided that I wanted to pursue that instead of just comparing like to like, it sort of narrowed it down for me. And I could find that objects that are completely different. For example, I compare like a quilt to basically a man-made engine. It sort of laid it out for me, and objects could be narrowed down pretty easily.
Thanks, Courtney. I think that's one of the delights of your website is the diversity of objects that you're looking at and putting into conversation with one another. All right, so you have your list of objects, you have your research done, you have your theme. So then the question of design, and this is really where the virtual space for dialogue diverged from the physical space for dialogue. How did you determine the design for your websites? Why did you make certain choices? Your ratio of text to image, how much control to navigate the viewer has, or how much freedom? And we'll start with Hallie.
Yeah, so once I had sort of settled on this idea of exploring how artists across mediums and cultures render home, I knew I knew that I wanted some sort of map to be the focus on my website, and ideally users would click on a location pin that corresponded with the location of the artwork, and it would take them to that work. But this was quite complicated from a web design perspective. But thankfully, I had taken art history 2 with Professor Coffey and Professor Kathler Taub. And for the final project, we used a software called Nightmap, by Nightmap called Storyboard to make a collaborative storyboard map of various artworks from around the world. The final product was really cool, and I ended up integrating that same software into my WordPress site for the Space for Dialogue. And this is what you're seeing play on the slide currently. Um, but because this was the focal point of my website, I had to come up with some creative solutions to get users to explore the rest of my website, such as adding in buttons at the bottom of each page. This seems like a really small thing, and I didn't even really think of that. But the process of designing and creating a website is pretty unique, and these small details that we take for granted online are really, really important to consider. So Allison Palazzolo was a huge help in not letting me overlook the small details in order to have the best possible site that still spoke to my own personal wishes and aesthetics. It was also pretty unique. It was also a pretty unique experience because some of the galleries whose permission I needed to use certain works were invested in seeing how the websites turned out, both in terms of object labels and captions, but also in terms of the user experience. So I sort of corresponded with them a bit about the design and if they had any sort of edits or advice for me, which was really cool to see that they also kind of cared about my show.
That's great. Thanks, Hallie. So Hallie added buttons so you could navigate more freely. Caroline, you took a different approach. Could you talk about your approach to website design?
Yeah, so I've briefly touched on sort of the route that I took with my exhibit was a bit more of like a guided learning experience than an exhibit in the way that we kind of expect it to be. And so there's only one way through my site. And I wanted to do that for a few reasons, but mostly so that I could sort of control the order that you view the objects, because the questions that I ask you to consider about each one kind of build on each other, and I start and end on the Assyrian reliefs. And so I didn't want to just have like a menu on the side of all of the objects, because that's not really like the experience that I was going for. And so I agree with Hallie. There were a lot of things when I was thinking about creating a website that I hadn't considered, and I definitely took for granted when I was looking at other people's sites. And I looked at a lot of different sort of like other virtual sites that other museums had created, and that was really helpful in honestly understanding what I didn't want more than what I did want. I'm an artist myself, and I got a little overwhelmed and a little excited about how many different options I could have, like with fonts and colors and all these things that even wouldn't have been possible in an in-person space. But I really had to, I think, hold back, and I wanted to create a website that really didn't distract at all from the objects. And there's a very sort of like minimalist, clean design that I went with, so that I can sort of create this vacuum that I want you to be interacting with these objects in, rather than, having all of these different things to compare at the same time.
Thank you, Caroline. Hallie alluded to this a little bit earlier. So one other difference between the in-person exhibition and the website is that when we put things up on the wall in the museum, we don't need to ask permission. We own those objects. What we don't own is the image of the object. That still belongs often with the artist or with the artist's estate. And so particularly for more contemporary objects, the students had to go through a process of both getting images for the website and permission to use those images. So I was hoping a couple of you could discuss that process. And we'll start with Courtney.
Yeah, for me, it was a surprisingly straightforward process. Usually artists have websites and they have contact information, and you can either email them or put your query in the little box that they provide. So the biggest challenge with that was just deciding when you should email them again to make sure they received it, because you don't want to really be bugging an artist that you want a favor from. But everyone was really, really nice, and it was very cool to talk to the artists, because I think all bar one of the artists that I feature in my exhibit are still alive. So I was talking directly to the people that I've thought so much about their work. So yeah, it was no real bumps in the road with that.
Thanks. Hadley?
So yeah, like Courtney, I guess I was fortunate in that I had some living artists that I included in my show. A number of artists, however, were deceased and had sort of made their work more than 100 years ago, so their art was in public domain. That was not an issue. Other artists, there were other artworks rather were made by anonymous artists, sort of like a teepee liner, for instance, where it's you see these figures painted within a teepee liner. It was made by an anonymous member of the Hunkpapa Lakota Sioux tribe. So there's no really there's no one to sort of ask for permission there. Other interactions I had with artists, with living artists. One, I reached out to Jillian Lab. She was a photographer who has a photograph that I include in the show, and she allowed me image permission under the sort of clause that I include a passage and a series of quotes that the subjects in the photograph had sort of expressed to her. And it was a great opportunity to reach out to artists and galleries and estates and have a sort of one-on-one interaction with all of these people within the art world. And it certainly taught me to be on top of my email and to hound people if they weren't being responsive. And at times I did ultimately get a response, and other times I did not. So definitely a valuable learning experience, and one that I'm glad that this process sort of gave me.
Thanks, Hadley. So exhibition design, like any large project, isn't typically a linear process. We all go through lots of drafts, lots of revisions. Certainly, I reach out to my colleagues to consult and talk through parts of my exhibition designs quite a lot. So how did you get feedback about your project? What challenges did you address, or what changes did you have to make? And we'll start with Claudia.
So as I've touched on a little bit earlier, I struggled a lot with narrowing down my works and organizing my show into a unified, cohesive theme. I worked closely with Amelia, who helped tremendously in directing my project and narrowing my works into an integrated theme with a specific time period within the history of photography. She helped me narrow my show into 3 subcategories that are roughly chronological. The first is voyeurism, the second is reflexivity through self-portraiture, and the third is dynamics of power and race, sexuality, and gender. Amelia also helped me fight my constant impulse to add more and more works to my show. And that helped me keep my focus on a single cohesive theme. Another challenge I've grappled with is dealing with the highly charged subject matter that I chose to include in my show. I've included controversial works by artists Robert Mapplethorpe and Nobuyoshi Araki, who both explore issues of race, power, and sexuality and BDSM in their photographs. I initially struggled over whether I even wanted to include them and how I would write object labels and exhibition text that could adequately capture the layers of complexity in those works. But Amelia guided me as I learned how to write concise yet effective labels that captured sort of the essence of the works as they apply to my show, while still properly addressing the loaded issues and controversies surrounding the images.
Thanks, Claudia. Courtney?
Yeah, I was very lucky with the staff at the Hood. They helped a lot, just making sure that I was telling not only like a cohesive story, but an interesting story. I had to change some of my comparisons because they were sort of straightforward. And I think that's where my interpretation of the objects sort of came into the fore. It wasn't just the story of the objects I was telling, it was also the story that I wanted to tell and the story that I found interesting. And so the staff at the Hood helped a lot with sort of crystallizing that, and also sort of empowering me to find what I wanted to say with that. And then they also helped a lot with just the look of the website, the categories, just making sure things were streamlined.
Thanks, Courtney. And Hadley?
So I guess that one thing that Zoom has sort of enabled us to do is have frequent and sort of consistent meetings and catch ups. So Amelia and I would meet weekly and discuss sort of areas of strengths and weaknesses in my show. Initially, it was a lot of my writing was sort of like rooted in just formal analysis and describing the work in depth and lacking this sort of critical component. So later on in the process, I began doing some more of that scholarly research that I mentioned earlier. Also, a big sort of phase of the project was making it accessible. So including alt text on all my images, making sure that all the text is legible when it does appear on the screen, that when it's converted from your laptop to a tablet to an iPhone, that it doesn't get all garbled and warbled, and that it's legible no matter what the device you're looking at it on is. And a big thank you to Allison Palazzolo. She is the digital content manager at the Hood, and she was really instrumental in sort of guiding me down that path and encouraging me to make tweaks and changes here and there, so that this exhibition can be enjoyed by as many people as possible.
Thanks, Hadley. So you've all been working on your exhibitions for many months now. As you're getting close to the finish line for this project, this almost year-long project, can you share any closing reflections on the project and on the process? And we'll start with Caroline.
Sure. So I think the main thing that this whole experience taught me, which I guess is sort of just a microcosm of what putting on, a major exhibit at a museum would be, is how many people have to be involved. And I think that's something that, we've all kind of touched on a little bit here and there, and how many people we're all really indebted to. But I think especially trying to do this virtually, it's a lot harder to involve that many people. You have to be really thoughtful about it, and you have to make sure that your schedules align. We're not going to run into each other in the hallways of the Hood and say, hey, actually, can I get your thoughts on this? And I think that was something that I wasn't really expecting about this move to the virtual was, if I needed advice on, even just changing one word in an object label, that needed to be something that, I needed to send an email, or I needed to schedule a meeting and those things. And I actually was really lucky to include some video in my exhibit, which I couldn't obviously go into film. And so Amelia carried me around the galleries on a laptop while Randall filmed for me. And so I think also realizing how dependent we are all on each other was something that this taught me, both in the Hood's context and just in our careers in general.
Thanks, Caroline. Claudia?
I'm tremendously grateful to have had the opportunity to participate in the Hood's intern program this year. Even though this year has not looked the way that anyone had anticipated it would, I think building for my space for dialogue virtually has allowed me a novel opportunity to learn a bit about how art exhibitions and museums and galleries work and can also be adapted to virtual contexts. I was able to research and find some online exhibitions that museums have done this year as examples, and the task of designing a website has given me even more liberties than an in-person installation might have, such as having total control over the design and layout and using features that aren't possible in physical spaces. I'm very glad now to have some experience with curatorial work and research, especially as I consider a future in careers in the arts. And lastly, I'm very indebted to the Hood staff and Amelia, and cannot thank them all enough for working with me through my virtual space for dialogue and the curatorial process, which has been such a joy and valued experience amidst this year of craziness and unpredictability.
Thanks, Claudia. Hallie?
Yeah, going into the internship, the space for dialogue was one of the aspects I was most excited about. And although it was definitely a shift when COVID struck and we got the news that our space for dialogues would now be virtual space for dialogues, the process of curating this exhibit was so rewarding. And like my peers have said, I'm so thankful to Amelia, Isadora, Allison, and all of the Hood staff that supported us through the process. This transition to the virtual world, for better or for worse, has really just taught us all so much about adaptability and having to shift things we would normally do in person to Zoom and other online platforms. And curating the virtual exhibit was no different and taught me how to be proactive, engaged, and adaptable when the experiences you envisioned have to change. And although we did not get to do some of the things that other intern classes have had the experience of, like picking a wall color or finding frames for our objects, we got to do so many other cool things by seeking to create an engaging show online. And the online presence of our shows just make it so much more accessible for family and friends who might not be able to see it if it were in person. Um, so yeah, I think the process has been very great.
Thanks, Hallie. Courtney?
Yeah, I definitely want to echo what Hallie just said. I think the ability to be adaptable, I think we all had very strong expectations for this internship, and they turned out different, but they didn't turn out worse. I think even though I've met almost none of these people in person, I feel like I know them so well, seeing them every week on my screen. And the process of making the exhibition, I think it gave me a lot of ownership over the museum's collection. I felt like it was a place where I could really explore, find new things, and then assembling it all together, sort of like what Caroline said. It involves so many different people, and everyone was so willing to help. And it just made me very grateful that I decided to apply to be an intern.
Thanks, Courtney. And Hadley?
Man, what to say that has not been said already? I guess like I'll echo sort of the sentiments that everyone else has mentioned. I was really grateful to have gotten this opportunity. I was supposed to take a computer science UX UI design course this spring. It didn't work out for scheduling conflict reasons, but I feel as though that I've definitely picked up some of those principles just by virtue of doing this and creating my own website, which is a skill that I'm very grateful to have acquired. Yeah, I think that working closely with museum staff and people within a museum space was really rewarding. It certainly sort of shone a light on a side of museums that I hadn't been exposed to prior. And yeah, I despite the virtual circumstances, I'm super thrilled with how my exhibition turned out. I'm very excited for people to begin navigating through it.
Well, thank you so much, Hadley, Hallie, Claudia, Caroline, and Courtney. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and being really transparent about your process. So we'd love to take some questions from the audience. So please feel free to put those into chat. I'm just sharing links, and I put some in chat too, of a few folks whose sites are published. Not everyone's quite done yet. And also a link at the bottom to the previous Space for Dialogues in case you're curious about the history of these websites. These are ones that were done during the Hood's closure. So if anyone has any questions for any of our panelists, we'd love to hear them. So we have a question here. We touched on this, but what were some of the advantages of a virtual version of an exhibition? Does anyone want to take that?
I can, because I think I really thought about how to make this like something that couldn't have even been done in person. And I think what I was really interested in was this idea of how other objects in the galleries are like going to influence what you're seeing, and the way that you're interacting with an object. You're not going to be able to not compare it to the things that are on the wall next to you. And so I think I actually kind of saw this as an advantage of being able to almost put blinders on my visitor and just show them what I want them to be looking at a given moment, with the text that I want them to be seeing at that moment and in the order that I want them to read things. And so I think it does give the viewer more control as well, but it certainly gave me more control for thinking about how I wanted to sort of, create the flow through my exhibit and things like that you obviously couldn't control in an in-person setting. And so it's not really what we think of when we think of, the curatorial process, but it added a layer that was really, I think, an exciting challenge.
Just leaving space in case anyone else wants to jump in. We have another great question, which is, what advice do you have for future interns?
I could take this. I would say you get from this internship what you put into it. I think the Hood staff are so willing to help you when you ask for help, but if you don't ask for it, you won't receive it. And so I think this could be such a valuable experience, but it depends on sort of how you approach it in a good way. It's a lot of autonomy, I suppose.
I could maybe hop in. I think I'll maybe try to address both questions. Sort of because this whole process was virtual, you were given almost that much more autonomy and freedom and the chance to be creative. You know, like the physical space that you're no longer occupying a physical space with these exhibitions, you're occupying a virtual one. So you can, you know, it doesn't really matter how many sculptural works versus flat works you might be using. But I think that even though future interns may or may not, they will likely be returning to these physical in-person spaces for dialogue, definitely like, I think you should retain that sort of urge to create and be creative. Really, the sky's the limit. Don't let a weird, you know, I think that if you want to exhibit a weird work and tie it in somehow, by all means, go for it. I think there is an extreme wealth of interesting, thought-provoking objects within the Hood collection, and just, you know, don't be afraid to find a strange one or find a compelling one or find one that has never been taken off the shelf and, you know, dust it off. This is your chance to show it to the world and make the most of that chance, I think.
Please, please. That's what we want. We want you all to kind of mine the Hood's collection and find the things that haven't seen the light of day, or think about how things can be put in conversation that we haven't thought of before. We have a question about the length of time these projects took. Do you all want to comment on that?
I can jump in on that. I don't know if I can necessarily put a time value on these projects, because I think for all of us, they occupied a lot of our brain space, even when we were sleeping and eating and just thinking through these thoughts. But I will say that we have been working on these for the whole year, and the Hood and Amelia and everyone who sort of supported us through the process really did a great job sort of setting goals and like sort of deadlines for us to meet in order to complete these, because curating a show can be such an overwhelming prospect, and it was. So it was definitely something that was broken into manageable pieces, and the nature of the internship is a 10-hour work week, and you can work more or less depending on your schedule. But I would say personally for me, I probably spent half my time each week working on my show and then half the time doing other like campus engagement activities. Although some weeks I definitely spent a lot more time when I was perhaps a bit behind than some of the deadlines I had to meet, and other weeks I focused more on campus engagement stuff. But I hope that helped.
There's a great question in chat, which is, what 3 things did you learn about yourself during the process? And I'll open that up and say, if you want to say only 1 thing or 2 things, you know, that's good too. But were there some things you learned about yourself tackling these big projects?
I like deadlines. Deadlines really help me stay organized. And very early on, all the interns were given a sort of like year-long punch list, and everything was broken down like month by month, term by term, what you're supposed to be, or what you should have done if you want to remain on track. And that was super helpful from the beginning, to refer to and to sort of set, like, you know, to plug into my own calendar, and yeah, definitely something I learned about myself.
I learned that I really like to think things through visually. I actually built my website as I was sort of writing the text so that I could see, you know, how much text would look good next to this image and things, rather than sort of taking it step by step and then putting it all into the website at the end. And that almost sounds like kind of a not very efficient way of doing things, because I wound up having to edit the website over and over again. But I learned that it was really helpful to actually think things through spatially, even though I didn't really think of myself as that sort of like needing to work in that way. It was really helpful, I think, because there was this, you know, aesthetic component of the curatorial process.
I learned that web design is not my passion. It's not something that I will be pursuing in this life, but it was fun to dip a toe in those waters.
I think I learned to like trust my instincts and do what I was interested in because I like went through a lot of different ideas about like what I thought a show should look like and like what parts of the collection like should be shown, but ended up just doing something that I found myself returning to in my classes as something I was interested in researching.
Yeah, just to like echo what Claudia said, I also sort of learned to trust my instincts in a sense. The theme for my show is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. Whether or not I sort of recognize that, I think the idea of home identity and belonging is something really important to me. And on my page, you guys can read about that. I don't want to bore anyone, but yeah, I think just like sort of exploring what you're interested in and finding something that you're passionate about exploring. And my parents will laugh if they hear me say that because they've been telling me that my whole life. But I think this internship really solidified that.
Great, thank you, everyone. If you had to select a favorite object from your exhibition, what would it be and why? Can you choose just one?
I can go, but so I actually do have a favorite object, and it's sort of oscillated between two. One is a um, oil on canvas by Alice Rahan, and it's called La Villa Orientale, and this is sort of the central image of my show. However, my favorite image is this print by Risabura Kimura, who is a Japanese artist, and it's titled Cityscape. And the reason that that is my favorite work in my show is because one, it sort of was the first work that I found aesthetically pleasing that I was like, I need this to be in my show. And I knew nothing about the object. So purely for an aesthetic reason, I like that. And second, I think it's my favorite object label that I wrote. It was one of the objects that did not have a wealth of information on it in the Hood's object files nor online. And so it was really cool that I got to sort of create my own object label. And I'm really proud of that. So that is why that's my favorite work.
I think my favorite work would be a quilt that I feature. It's called Strips by Louisiana P. Bendolph. And what I like about it is she doesn't consider herself an artist. The quilt is a recent acquisition into the collection, but she said in my research, I found that she said when someone first called her an artist, she kind of took a step back because she makes quilts, but she didn't really consider herself an artist. And I think that her quilt is now in a museum's collection. It's featured in my exhibit. It just sort of makes me think that absolutely anyone could be an artist. It's not a special category. It's open to anyone.
There's a necklace that I've included in my exhibit that I think actually is my favorite, and I wouldn't have thought of that until I was asked to think about it, but it was one of the first pieces that I found after I knew that I wanted to talk about the Assyrian reliefs and to talk about their like very weird story of winding up at the Hood. And I didn't know if other objects in the Hood's collection were going to have, easily accessible information. I assumed that all the interesting stories would have been lost. And I was just looking at, the ancient collection, and I found this beautiful necklace. It's this blue chain of beads with an amulet at the end. And when I was reading about it, totally by chance, I don't even know why I really clicked on it other than I thought that it was really quite beautiful. The amulet and the chain of beads were not originally together in ancient Egypt. An art dealer in the 1800s, we think, just attached them so that I guess it could be more expensive or so it would look more, ancient or important or mystical or something. And I thought that story, it struck me. It was so fascinating to me. I just wondered how many other things, that we've seen that have been, perhaps restored incorrectly or constructed or deconstructed or broken, or those things that happen to an object and all of the time that passed between when it was made and when we're seeing it in a museum. I just really couldn't shake that thought. And so that object has been it actually raised a lot more questions for me than it answered. And so I think that's something that really, for me, confirmed that what I was trying to do with my exhibit was worth doing.
Man, you're like asking me to choose, what my favorite child is. I think one of the more interesting, more compelling works that I've included, and it is one of my favorites, is this teepee liner that I mentioned earlier, and it's a giant piece of tanned rawhide with these drawings that depict the exploits of the life of this man named Chahupa, whose name translates to jaw. And so there are scenes from like war raids, or in scenes where he's also sort of cuddling with his wife, and it's each little vignette that has been painted on this liner is a cool sort of private moment from this man's life. And I think that's just an interesting, it's almost like a tapestry, and it weaves this really complex narrative. And it's also something that I've never seen before. It's a type of object that I've never encountered. So that's one reason why I was so interested in it and enchanted by it.
All right. Well, I'd really like to thank the audience for joining us today to hear about this process. And I'd love to thank my colleagues at the Hood and across the college who supported all of the interns this year working on these virtual Space for Dialogue exhibitions. And I'd especially like to thank Hallie, Hadley, Caroline, Courtney, and Claudia for coming on today and being so generous with your time and sharing the process of these very long, involved projects that took the bulk of the year. I am very impressed with what you've created, and I hope you are very proud of the work that you've done. So thank you so much for putting your heart and soul into your museum work this year. Thanks, everybody.